Hi everyone, and welcome to this tutorial clip. In this video, we're going to be looking at the permissions lab for Linux. So I'm already logged in with my standard account. That is the Jay Dixon account that I created in the previous lab. You should be using your corresponding account there. And we'll get started on the first step, which is creating a directory called permissions in the home directory. So I'm already in the home directory. All I have to do is say make dir and then permissions. And that directory has now been created. If we look at ownership and such, I'll just do a long listing in my home directory, and we can see that permissions is owned by Jay Dixon the user. It's owned by Jay Dixon the group. If we look at the permissions that it has, we can see there's read, write, execute for the user, full permissions, read, write, execute for the group, and then read, execute for other. So we're pretty much set to go from there. Now I also have to create a file, a text file if you wish, that's going to be in permissions. So I'm just going to say touch, and then I'm going to use the path permissions slash, and then following what's in the book, it'll be myfile.txt. If I do a long listing of permissions, I will be able to see that I am the owner of that file, both my user account and my primary group. We can see that from a standard permissions perspective, my user gets read-write, my group gets read-write, and other gets read. So that's all fine. From that perspective, again, the maximum permission you can get on a file without changing it is going to be read-write. You will never get execute as being a standard permission, no matter what, on a file, because that's very dangerous from a security perspective. If this was a script or even an executable file, we'd have to go and later on modify the permission, include the X, so that we can actually execute it. All right, so that takes care of the first two steps. Nothing sort of special there. Now, the next thing, or sorry, the first step, the next thing we want to do is we're going to copy a file from the etc directory into permissions. And that file is supposed to be owned by root. Now, pretty much all the files in etc are owned by root. I'm going to use the one that is in the book, which is hosts. So if we start off and do a long listing of /etc and hosts, we will see that that file is indeed owned by the root. Now, if I copy that, so I'll say etc and hosts, and then I put that into my permissions directory, do a long listing of what is in permissions. And we can see that the file is owned by me. Now, why is that? Well, I made a copy. So the file that's in my home directory is one that is brand new. It's not, I didn't move the one that was in the etc directory. I'm in a brand new file based on the one that's in the etc directory. So that means I created that file, and therefore I'm going to own it. Now, to look at something a little bit different, what we're going to do is create a file in the permissions directory, but it's going to be owned by the root. Now, how are we going to do that? That means we have to be the root user to make that happen. So I'm going to do an SU and log in as root. And because I know the password, I'm able to do that. So now notice that I'm logged in as root. I'm in the root user's home directory. So what I'm going to say is touch, and then /home, and me, and my permissions directory, and we'll call this root file. So we've got a file now created in the home directory, should be owned by root. I'm going to exit out of the switch user. I'm back to me. I'll do a long listing of permissions, and we'll see inside there that that root file is owned by root. Awesome. Now, what we want to do is, so that was step 4, looking at those permissions. What we want to do is let's try and change the ownership of all those files and permissions to me. So what I'm going to do is say chown, chown, and then the user is going to be me. And what I'm going to be working on is in the permissions directory, all files. So the permissions directory and a star. And when I hit enter, we can see that we're going to get an error coming back. The operation's not permitted, changing the ownership on root file. And the reason for that, of course, is I don't own it, and root user is the only user that can change ownership. Okay. However, I do have a secret weapon up my sleeve, because you might remember that our user account can do anything we want by using sudo. So if I just up arrow to this command, go over to the beginning of line and stick sudo in front of that. So I'm going to do sudo chown and then my user account and permissions. We'll try that. It's going to prompt me for my password. Punch that in. And now if we do a listing of the permissions directory, we see that I indeed own the root file. But notice that it's me as the user. I didn't specify anything as the group. So the root group still owns that file. Now I'm going to put this ownership back because I also want to show you about changing the group ownership as well. So I'll just say root for this and we'll put it back to where it was. So if I go back and look at the permissions, I can see that it is now root and root. I'm going to, oops, didn't mean to do that. That's okay though. I accidentally changed those other two files to being root ownership because I didn't specify the specific file. But what we're going to do is sudo, we'll go back and do this change to me, but in this particular case, instead of just specifying me as the user, I'm also going to put in me as the primary group. So that way I'm changing the user and the group at the same time on all the files in the permissions directory. I'll say go ahead and do that. And now if I do a long listing of the permissions directory, I can see that all of the files are owned by both my user account and my primary group. So again, normally this is something that only the root user can do, but because of the fact that I have the ability to basically do anything I want using the sudo command, I can simply say, hey, sudo change ownership to me, and we're basically good to go from there. Right. So we've got the change made there. Now the next thing we want to do is let's make sure that we've got a permission on all of those files as 644. So 6 means read write, 4 means read only. Right now, if we look at the way those files are set up, the hosts file is read write for the user, read for the group, read for other. If we look at the root file, it's read write for the user, read for the group, read for other. And then if we look at that my file that I created earlier, it's read write for the user, read write for the group, and read for other. So we can do a couple different things here. If we look at what we have, absolutely, we can see that for the hosts file and the root file, we need to add the right permission in for the group. I can do that alphabetically very, very easily, and I can do that either with relative or I can do it with absolute as far as the group is concerned. Before we get into that though, let me show you something fairly easy. If you're not really sure the translation between the numeric and the alpha, eventually you're going to get that sorted out. But we also have this command called stat. And what stat will do is show us all kinds of nice information about the file, including the mode or the permissions if you wish. And that's going to be both in alpha and in numeric. So for example, if I say stat and then permissions/hosts, then you can see on the output of that command a couple lines down that there's an access, and you can see it says 0644, and then after that it'll tell you read write, and then read, and then read. So if you're not quite sure of that translation, that's a very quick way to find that. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to be able to modify the permissions. I don't have to sudo this because I own all the files, so I can basically change the permissions as I want. But I'll just do a long listing in there again so that we can get a fresh kind of view. And I want to change hosts so that I'm going to add the right permission on for the group. So I'll say change mode, chmod. I'm going to say group plus W. It's already got read. We need to add the W onto it. And then the file is going to be permissions and then hosts. So I'll say OK for that. We'll go back and do a long listing on permissions once again. And we can see now, if you look at hosts, the group has read-write. Perfect. Now, we still have root file to deal with, and I didn't do them both at the same time because I want to demonstrate a different thing that we can do. So instead of instead of relative, we can do absolute. So I can say chmod. I'm going to say that group is equal to RW. So in other words, instead of saying I want to add the write, I'm going to set it to read write period. I don't care what it is now, it's going to be read and write. And then I'll do that on the root file. Oops, sorry, that has to go in the permissions directory and the root file. I'll hit enter, and once again I'll do a long listing of permissions. And we can see now everything is read-write for the user, read-write for the group, and then read for other. Now the other thing we can do, just to demonstrate the numeric side of things, what I'm going to do is take away write for group and user. So what I can do is I'll say change mode. I'm going to say that user and group lose write. So I'm going to subtract write from the user and the group. And let's do that on the hosts file. So I'll say go ahead and do that. And now if I do a long listing of permissions, we can see that the host file has read for the user, read for the group, and then read also for other. Now if we want to put that back and we want to use numeric, we know that read-write is 6. We know that read-only is 4. So what I can do is say chmod 664 on permissions and the hosts file. And now if I do a long listing of permissions, sure enough, we see that that is now back to read-write, read-write, and read. Terrific. We also want to make sure that 755 or read-write-execute, along with read-execute and read-execute, is set on my directories. If I do a long listing right now, we can see that on permissions, this is actually read-write-execute, read-write-execute, read-execute, or in other words, 775. So I can do a couple things here again. I need to change the group so the group does not have write permission. So what can I do that with? Well, I can come along and say chmod, and I can change that to group -W. I'm going to lose the write for the group on permissions. I'll hit enter. If I do a long listing, sure enough now it is read-write-execute, read-execute, read-execute. If we want to make sure, I can say stat on permissions, and we can see that, sure enough, that is 755, just like the exercise is asking for. Now, if I want to put that back, so let's say that I want everybody to have read-write-execute, I can say, all right, I'll do chmod, I'll do 777, read-write-execute for all 3 of them, and then I can say on permissions, enter. And if I do a long listing, here we can see that everybody has read-write-execute. You can also see that Linux displays this in a different color. It's just a bit of a warning to say, hey, you know what, everybody's got full permission to this. You just might want to be careful in case that's not what you want. Okay. And if we want to get to the point of 755, again, I can say chmod. In this case, group and owner or other have too much. They should not have the write permission. It should just be read and execute. So I can say group and other is going to equal read execute. So I'll get rid of the W part. And again, I can set this on permissions. I'll hit enter. And if I do a long listing, then I can see that I'm back to my 755, or users read write execute, the group is read execute, and other is read execute. So basically when it comes to permissions, one of the things that you should do is pick whatever's going to be easiest for you. If you like alpha, great, go for it. If you like doing everything relative where you're adding, subtracting, fine. If you want to set it so everything is absolute and it's equal to something, no problem. Whatever it is you find easiest to do, that is the way that you should approach it. There's no wrong way. Now, the last part of this lab exercise is kind of looking at the numerics and seeing, hey, do they jive out with whatever the alpha is? The answers are there in your book. I'm not going to bother going through those. You can wrap those up on your own. Okay. Now, the last part, or the second part of this particular lab, is going to be doing part of Lab 7.1, which is going to be in your textbook. So there's a couple things here I want to go through. We're going to do the first two steps. The last steps are beyond kind of what we were doing before. So I don't want to spend a huge amount of time getting into advanced permissions and that kind of thing. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to set up two directories. Under the file system root, we're going to have something called data. And then inside each one of those, we're going to have a sales and an account. So we'll go ahead and set that up. I want to do this specifically because we're also going to show where sudo comes into play. So right now I'm logged into my account, same as we have been all along. If I come along and I want to do make dir, and let's say I'm going to do sales first, so we'll do -p so we can do all this in one command. I'm going to say /data and /sales. And if I tell it to go ahead and do that, I get permission denied. Because if you want to create anything, directory, file, what have you, at the file system root, you have to have permissions for that, elevated privileges for that. So again, if I up arrow, look at that command, and come back over to the beginning and put sudo in front of that, then hit enter. I'll put in my password. And now, no error. So if I do a long listing at the file system root, up there near the top 3 down, we can see that there is a data directory. It's owned by root because I did a sudo, so that means that the work is done by the root account. And that is set up by default so that read, write, execute for the user, read, write, execute for the group, and read, execute for the other. The other directory I have to create under data is called account, so I'll go ahead and do that. Again, I have to sudo because I don't have permissions for that by default. And then I'm going to say make directory, and that'll be /data and /account. Oops. Account. Great. Now, if I go back and do a long listing of /data, then we're going to see that sure enough, there's account, there's sales, everything's owned by root, and we're basically finished the first step for Lab 7.1. Now, if we want to go into step 2, what we need to do is change the ownership. So we want root to still be the user. We want to change it so that our sales group is going to be the group owner of the sales directory, and the account group is going to be the owner of the account directory. Okay, fair enough. Now we got a couple different things that we can do here, and I'll demonstrate both of those as we go. The first one is we can use change owner. Again, ownership, you have to have privileges, so I'm going to say sudo. I'm going to say chown. And on sales, what I would have to do, we want the root user to remain as the user owner. So I would say root, and then, sales, not users, sales on /data /sales. And if I go and do a long listing on data and sales, just data, then I can see that sales is now owned by the sales group along with the root user. Okay, no problem. The other thing we can do is we can use the change group, which will only modify the group ownership. So instead of doing chown with user group, instead I just do chgrp or change group and with the group only. So again, sudo change group, and then I'm going to specify that my group is going to be account, and that's going to be on /data /account. Enter. And then if I once again do a long listing of data, we can see that account owns the accounting group now from a group perspective, the accounting directory from a group perspective, and root is still the user owner. Right. Last thing we want to do here is that we want to change the permissions. So the root user should still have read, write, execute. the group owner should have read, write, execute, and right now it is only read, execute. And then the last thing is nobody else should have access. So in other words, sales shouldn't be able to get into account shouldn't be able to get into sales, and whatever else we have shouldn't be able to get in there either. So we're going to use Chmod for that. Once again, if you're forgetting what the commands are, don't forget about our friend tab. So all you have to remember is ch or change. If I do that, I hit one tab, doesn't do anything for us, hit another tab, and we've got all of the commands that start with ch. Hopefully you can remember what chmod, chown, chirp, that type of a thing is going to help you out with. Anyway, in this case, we're going to change the mode. So we'll do chmod, and in this particular case, we know that we want in the data directory, both of those directories, sales and accounts, to be having the group with read, write, execute, whereas right now they only have read, execute. And for other, we want to totally get rid of that. So if we want to do that numerically, very simply, we say 7, read, write, execute for the user, read, write, execute for the group, 0 for everybody else. And then I can say /data/* and enter. And guess what? Didn't put the sudo in front of that. My bad, but good illustration for you. Up arrow, beginning of the line, sudo, go. And now if I do a long listing of /data, I can see that sure enough, user and group owners both get read, write, execute, and other gets nothing. So we've now got those two directories that are going to be isolated, so only the members of their own team groups are going to be able to get into those directories at all. And that wraps up permissions. So hopefully this has been helpful for you, as this is the end of the video, and we'll see you next time.